Welcome back to the channel. Last time we dry fitted the first row of the retaining wall, and today we're actually going to secure it to the ground. So let's get into it. Going out the morning after I did the initial dry fitting, I noticed that this board here on the front had a little bit of wobble to it. It might have been there the prior day and I just didn't notice, but it was relatively minor. The board was actually pretty straight. I think the high spot was just from the concrete pour below it. So I noticed it was rocking in this one section. I decided I was going to mark out where that was and later tried to sand down this board with some rough grit sandpaper in the hopes of taking down that high spot and getting rid of that wobble. And once that's taken care of, we're going to start securing all these boards to the ground. As for how we're going to do that, I bought myself a hammer drill. This is a relatively cheap one at about $75. I did make sure to buy one that was corded because, quite frankly, drilling through concrete will absolutely kill batteries faster than you can imagine. Then I bought the two largest bits I have purchased for any project ever in my life. This first one here is only to go through the wood, and even though the pieces are only 6 inches thick, the thought was if I need to go through multiple layers, I can do that with a bit this long. But that bit is for the wood only. To go into the concrete below it, what we're going to use is this other bit here. This is a specialized masonry bit. And we're basically trying to drill a continuous hole through the lumber into the concrete below it, and then we're going to stake the lumber into the footing below it using a section of rebar. Now you're probably thinking that this one piece of rebar doesn't look like it's going to be enough, considering I have roughly 80 linear feet of fence here, and you'd be correct in thinking that, which is why I bought a lot of rebar. In fact, probably too much. But rebar is cheap and going to the store takes a lot of time, so I would rather not have to make those trips again unless I absolutely need to. The depth of the rebar staking is going to depend on your building code and what you're going into. It's going to be different for if you're going into dirt versus if you're going into a concrete base like this, but check your local restrictions and size your tools accordingly. As for the starting point, if we started on the outside edges and worked in, there's a chance that this front corner would not line up or look good, so we are going to start there and we're going to work our way back. That is our best chance of having this thing look as good as it can. So with all that said, let's re-level that first piece of timber, then start staking this into the ground. To fix the wobbly board, I marked out where the high spot was located, and I put coarse sandpaper on my orbital sander thinking that I was just going to take that section out of the wood. I got a little impatient with this after about a minute or so and realized it would be much faster with my grinding wheel to just take down the concrete below it. And while this was a little bit messier, it was a lot faster and got the same end result. Once that was sitting flat, I went back and I reset my string line on this long run. I repositioned this short board on the bottom step because that's going to be the very first thing we're staking in, and then I marked in equal distances from both ends for those two stakes. You'll notice that I don't drill through the wood while it's sitting on the ground, and that's because if we hit the concrete on the backside when we come out the timber on the other side, it will absolutely destroy this bit that is only meant for wood. And these bits were not cheap. They were somewhere around $30 a piece. So I was very motivated to not completely destroy them on the first hole I drilled. And with the holes drilled in my timber blocks, I went and I measured out my rebar stake, cut it to length, and began staking it through the timber block. I deliberately cut the tips of these to be sharp points, because when I put the timber back and I hammer these stakes through into the concrete below, the sharp points will actually cut in a little dimple to the concrete face below it. And I use that dimple with the other drill bit to drill the hole that these stakes will go into. Or in other words, I deliberately left them sharp to use them as a punch so that I knew the exact location to start the holes below it so that my alignment would be perfect. So once the dimples were made, I could just change over to the masonry bit and drill the staking holes using my hammer drill. I'm doing my best to keep the angle of the concrete holes the same as the angle of the timber holes. Otherwise, when the rod goes through both of them, it'll look a little bit twisted if they're not in line with each other. I went as deep as I could with the concrete bit until I hit the granite below it. This bit could not get through that granite, but we were deeper than building code, so it was okay to stake these in, which is done with the precision expertise of a sledgehammer. And with the rebar driven fully into the ground, I cut off the excess on the top and then started to line up my next piece. But in all my excitement, there was one thing I realized I forgot. Now, one thing I forgot to do that I haven't done yet is you have to seal the cut edges before you put everything in the way, because otherwise obviously you can't get to them. Now over here, as you can see, there's a little bit of a gap, and the reason for that is when I drove this down, I had these cut so it was like this, where the angle was all pointed to one side, which means the indent in the concrete below was not centered, but I drilled as if it was centered. So basically I shifted them both over about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch, and that gave us this gap here at the edge. Now fortunately I could still reach in there with a paintbrush and get that pretty easily, so we can still get to that one. Before we secure this one here, we're going to hit this face and we're going to hit this face here. Otherwise over time those edges will start to rot because they are not treated in any way like the rest of this is on the outside. But with that said, we know where we want this next one to line up. I'm going to go ahead and mark the back line with a pencil so that it's easier to slide right back into place afterwards. And then we're going to get the next section of our wall done, and then before we fasten that one down, we will get these edges stained. So at this point it's just going to be a rinse and repeat. It's going to take a lot more time and effort than I am ever hoping to do, but we'll get it done. To be completely honest, while I was really motivated to get the project done at this point, I was not looking forward to this day that I had ahead of me, because drilling those first couple concrete holes were absolutely miserable. Not only is it just hard to do, it's also just a ton of stress and vibration on the hands and wrists, and doing that for probably 8 to 10 hours was definitely going to take a toll on my body. I started by pre-drilling all of the holes in the timber blocks first because that was quick and easy, partially to procrastinate that part, but also because I didn't want to be constantly changing out the drill bit. Then I swapped to the concrete drill bit after all of those were done. And like I discovered when I did that first piece, having a point on the rebar didn't hit at the center of where the hole had to be drilled. So on this second piece, instead of having it point off to one side, I had it point like an arrow towards the center. Then when I was putting it through the timber block, I oriented it specifically so that it would be pointing the correct direction. On one hand, I really wish I could have tried a bunch of these things out in an area that wasn't front and center every single time I see this wall, but I knew if I tried it in a corner and it didn't work, the chances of this front corner not lining up as a result were substantially higher. So unfortunately, what was probably the most critical section of the wall was also the one where I was experiencing the biggest learning curve. Luckily though, cutting the tip differently did help a lot with the alignment on this second piece, and I was ready to drive it into the ground. Before doing so, like I said before, I had to put stain on the end of all the blocks that were cut just to reseal those edges. Then I was able to drive the stakes into the footing, then trim the stakes to length on top. Which brings me to the third section of timber where I finally figured it out and did the smart thing that I should have done from the start. And that is putting the timber in place, running the concrete bit through the hole that is in the timber, and that ensures that not only am I drilling in the perfect location, but I'm also drilling at the perfect angle to match the hole in the timber. Like I said, I was doing this after a head injury, so the fact that it took me 3 times to figure that out shouldn't be very surprising. And as a note, you're not going the full depth with the timber in place, you're just going an inch or two to get it started and get enough depth that the angle is pretty much locked in. Then you're going to get the timber out of the way and drill the rest of the depth, because this is going to be pulling up a lot of concrete and stuff, and having to pull it out of the timber entirely is really going to be limiting. That said, this plan worked phenomenally, and I felt so much smarter after figuring this out. And it's not even that this made me feel smart, it just made me feel really stupid beforehand. I was now ready to start on that second row, and I quickly realized I did a terrible job flush cutting the top of those rebar pieces, but before I could resolve any of that, my camera died from the heat. At this point, I had to come back another day to finish off the rest of these stakes, and in the meantime, I did a little research on how to try to prolong the life of these drill bits, because I burnt through the first one relatively quick. Especially with the outdoor temperatures being so hot, I was really overheating the bit, which completely wore it down way too fast, and the solution to that was to let the drill do the work instead of me putting my body weight into the thing, and to use something as a coolant to try to regulate the temperature of the drill. On the first day, I did try using a little bit of machinist oil. That really didn't do a whole lot for this concrete, so today I just poured a bunch of water in it, knowing that even at boiling point, water is not going to get over 212 degrees. And while that did help with the lifespan of the drill bits, I found very quickly, especially on this end, that I was running into granite slab underneath, which again, I could not drill through. The problem was the granite was at a different depth for every single hole, making it a little bit inconsistent, and I couldn't even anticipate where that line would be. I was able to play with different diameter drill bits that could make it through the granite. I got enough into it that we actually got a strong foundation, and finally, after 3 full days of working, this first row was completed. And while I wasn't thrilled about being drenched in sweat then caked in concrete dust, the first layer was officially done and it looked great. Using the string line, the farthest deviation that I had along the entire roughly 40-foot section was 1/4 of an inch. As a first-timer who's never done this before, that is absolutely phenomenal, and my gaps between all the boards the entire way down looked great. The first row is by far the hardest and most time-consuming section to do, so the fact that this one came out so well means that everything else should be an absolute breeze from here on out. So join me next time when we can pick up the pace and turn up the heat. Thanks for watching.